So I would like to warmly thank the Prometheus Research Institute, the Institute for European Studies of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and the Center for China Studies between the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences and the European University of Cyprus for their kind invitation. As the title of our conference very clearly highlights, we are witnessing a fast-changing world. But the most important characteristic of this world is not simply the speed of change. It is the complexity and the permanence of the crises and challenges we face, which are unprecedented since the end of the Second World War. In 15 years, we have been through a global economic crisis after the Lehman Brothers crash, wars in Ukraine, the Middle East, and Afghanistan, an unprecedented refugee crisis in Europe, a global pandemic, a supply chain, energy, and price crisis precipitated by the war in Ukraine. And of course, we see every day the effects of a wider climate crisis, which is radically affecting societies, economies, security, and the movement of peoples. What is clear is that exactly at this moment, when the common threats are becoming more acute and more permanent, the multilateral diplomatic tools and institutions we have are insufficient to deal with them. They were developed after the Second World War, as other speakers have said, in a world of two blocks, and then they were enhanced in a unipolar world after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So these institutions and arrangements are not enough to support global and regional peace and stability, as well as human security and sustainable growth. We all agree, of course, that multilateral arrangements do not develop based just on the ingenuity of diplomats or the pressure from civil society, but they are based on the balance of power in a historical period. And in this context, it is rightly crucial to discuss what the new US, China, Europe balance will be. And I think this has been a focus we've had. And I believe strongly it is possible, and we already have found important fields of strategic cooperation with China. And Greece has been doing this particularly through the last years. But before we get into this discussion about this balance, there is a broader question that we Europeans must ask ourselves, which is the role that we believe Europe should have in this multipolar world. It is clear that the election and policies of President Trump mean that we cannot depend on the transatlantic relationship and the institutions it was based on for our security as we have done for the last 80 years. The developments in the war in Ukraine following the Russian invasion and the at least partial success of Russia mean that we need to upgrade our military capacities for deterrence, including in terms of cybersecurity. And the global economic and technological competition, not only with the US and China, but also with India and rising forces of the global South, mean that we need to strengthen our economic capacities. Finally, we see how inequalities and a weakness of dealing effectively with new challenges have led to the rise of the extreme right, which means that the European project itself is weakened, and we need social cohesion even more. To put it simply, Europe needs a dynamic vision for its peoples and its international role. If it does not find this vision, its role in the balance with the EU, with the US and China, and its capacity to influence global events will be weak. And if the role of Europe in this balance is weak, then it will be extremely difficult for the international community to develop this new multilateralism that we have talked about and a new multipolar international order. Then it will depend even more on the balance of power that we are discussing, while what we actually need is a new multipolar order with new arrangements. A new order that must go beyond the balance and include the equitable representation of the global South. And as Ambassador Al-Jawaili has been saying, we must not go back to this triangular perspective that Professor Tianping has said, a triangular perspective of balance just between US, Russia, and China. In this context, it is Europe that must step up with specific priorities. First of all, we must use our common foreign and security policy and our enlargement and neighborhood policies to establish strategic autonomy and play a role not only of deterrence, but most importantly as a force of peace and stability, particularly in regions where NATO should or cannot be present. This means retaining transatlantic dialogue but not depending on it. It means that investing in rearmed Europe makes sense only if we have strategic goals to be a force of peace and stability. Building a war economy or some kind of military Keynesianism is a certain path to disaster. We need stronger and smarter deterrence, but we do not need militarization of European society and economy. So in Ukraine, we need peace with the best possible terms for Kiev, a peacekeeping force, and a choice for a European future for Ukraine. But we must accept that we need a different Western strategy for Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova than the one we had since 2008, which has failed. A strategy where there is a commitment not to a NATO, but to an EU perspective for these countries, and a different security architecture that includes tools to deter Russia, but also to open up a framework for dialogue. We must also rise to the occasion in relation to Israel and the need for peace in Palestine with an end to Israeli operations that have resulted in thousands of civilian deaths, with a return of hostages, immediate provision of humanitarian aid, and the resumption of talks for two states on the basis of UN resolutions. Former Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras has underlined that there must be sanctions on Israel if we do not move in this direction. We cannot convince anyone, particularly in the global south, of our principles, of European principles, if we prove to have double standards. The same is true for Turkey. As the Prime Minister has underlined, there must be a clear European message to Ankara that what is happening to Mayor Imamoglu is unacceptable, and it will have consequences in relation to the EU. It must be made clear that the EU, yes, there is an important potential for EU-Turkey relations to grow, not only in terms of a defense relationship, but in terms of economic agreements, but it can only move ahead on the basis of respect for the sovereign rights of EU countries, including Greece and Cyprus. And Europe must do all it can to support a just and viable solution on the Cyprus issue on the basis of UN resolutions for the benefit of all the people of Cyprus, Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots. And it must move faster in the enlargement of the Western Balkans. If we cannot be a reliable force in this neighborhood, in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Balkans, then we cannot be reliable and strong in the rest of the world. And we cannot have the strength to handle the US-China balance that we referred to before. Secondly, in terms of economy, it is not enough to talk about trade. And we've had successes with the agreement with India and the trade agreement with India. But we need to be a dynamic player, and the only way is to look at our own financial architecture and to learn from our mistakes. As we learn from the mistakes in terms of Western intervention, we need to learn from our mistakes in terms of how we handle the Eurozone crisis. In the last period, Germany has canceled the debt brake, and it has instituted a new fiscal program of approximately 900 billion, the largest fiscal expansion in Germany's history, and a permanent break from Wolfgang Schäuble's logic that was imposed during the Eurozone crisis. This will help, but also it means that Germany's debt will move up 80–90% of its GDP in the next decade. Germany cannot take these measures and keep the European countries in the economic straitjacket of the past, or give state aid to its own companies. So it is extremely important that the European fiscal architecture is changed, at least raising the debt threshold for everyone to around 100%, and allowing countries the space to strengthen their economies. And at the same time, we need to have to supplement our common monetary policy with a federal fiscal instrument, a Treasury Department, just like the US, empowered to issue common European debt, to strengthen our strategic autonomy on energy and defense, to facilitate the green transition, to restore the crumbling network of infrastructure and consolidate the European market, just like the Letta and Draghi reports say. And more importantly, to increase social cohesion and reduce inequalities. Because there is no use to have a great EU-India trade agreement if the social and political cohesion of the European Union is being weakened in the next years. That means that we cannot afford to cut cohesion funds for the benefit of a project of militarizing our economy more. We must invest in deterrence, but not at the expense of social cohesion. We should at last speak about European public goods and the freedom to stay, which I think is a very interesting concept in the Letta report, which means that the obligation is in Europe and its member states to support all European citizens who reside in non-privileged areas to work and live where they work and live with dignity. So we need a whole new thinking in terms of a Europe of the future. I'd like to conclude with a few thoughts on the future of EU-China cooperation. As we all agree, I think, there are many weaknesses to the previous post-Cold War international order, and we mentioned some. But its strength was that international law, and Menelaos mentioned it, remained a reference point. International law was a reference point even when it was violated, and it was violated many times during and after the Cold War, but it was a reference point. It was possible to condemn an action or pressure a government because it violated international law. And this is something we must keep from the previous international order. In a period such as this, the great risk is that our reference point becomes might makes right. And we see what happens when what this logic brings. We see it in Gaza, we saw it in the meeting between President Trump and President Zelensky. We must not accept that there can be an international order where no rules exist and only the most powerful prevail on the geopolitical level. If we accept that on a geopolitical level, it will trickle down to our societies. It will lead not only to a new international order based completely on power, but to a new social order in our societies based only on power, where openly economic or political interests have the last word. So we must work for these better rules. And we have clearly common challenges on which to work. The global health crisis that we talked about, confronting the climate crisis, non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, promoting regional peace and security. And there's a lot of space to work with China strategically on these issues based on sovereign equality, as our Chinese colleagues have said. And I know Greece, and you know Greece and Cyprus, have a very important and strong role to play in this regard. But also, we need to find a common understanding in terms of the global economy, where we are in competition. We must keep in mind that in the longer term, the economic interests of our peoples are tied to our interdependence, to establishing and respecting common rules, and to coming to difficult but necessary agreements instead of strengthening trade imbalances or investing in tariffs and protectionism. The choice is not only a choice between neoliberal globalization or nationalist deglobalization. What we need is more equitable globalization and institutions that confront inequalities, not based on economic nationalism or imperialism. Finally, I think it's important that we speak also on areas where we don't see eye to eye, because in the previous areas we clearly have found some common ground. China is a great and dynamic but complex country, full of contradictions. There are millions of people that have left poverty behind because of policies of the Chinese government, but also there are areas on which we disagree and must be able to talk openly, whether it has to do with respect of human rights or respect of good neighborly relations and sovereign rights of smaller countries. In any case, I believe strongly that there is space, not only for dialogue and cooperation, but that word used in the subtitle of today's conference, community, and that we in Europe have to rediscover this word, the word community, in order to strengthen it on an international level. We need to support a new international community in order to achieve a more peaceful, equitable, and ecological multipolar order. Thank you.